Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Tuesday, 14 October 2025. It is the 140th anniversary of the birth of Erich von Kahler, who was born in Prague on this date in 1885. Like many European expatriates, he left off the fawn when he came to America. Kahler wrote at least three books relevant to the philosophy of history, but I didn't learn about him from discussions on his ideas in other philosophers but rather because I found copies of his books in used bookstores. And from this, I conclude that Kahler's philosophy of history isn't widely known or widely influential today. But any regular listeners will know that I don't exclusively focus on the rock stars among philosophers. I'll talk about anybody who had anything interesting to say, and Kahler has a lot of things that are interesting. Kahler gives us a straightforward speculative philosophy of history that's insightful and clarifying. There's no hint of obscurantism in Kahler, since it's the obscurantism, I should say, and since it's the obscurantism of famous speculative philosophers of history like Hegel that's used as a cudgel against anyone today who would formulate a speculative philosophy of history, Kahler is a welcome voice of clarity in the speculative camp. Kahler tells you what he means, and he doesn't talk in riddles, and I value that. Though he's not widely referenced today, he was respected and apparently very well connected in his time. The dust jacket of one of his books has blurbs from Thomas Mann, who was a good friend and correspondent over many years, Einstein, Jacques Barzun, Reinhold Niebuhr, Louis Mumford, T.S. Eliot, and others. The books I found in used bookstores by Kahler were Man the Measure, A New Approach to History from 1943, and The Meaning of History from 1964. The book that T.S. Eliot apparently praised was The Tower and the Abyss, an inquiry into the transformation of man of 1957, which appeared midway between Man the Measure and The Meaning of History. All three of these books taken together offer a unified interpretation of history. In Man the Measure, A New Approach to History, Kahler is doing philosophical anthropology, which I previously discussed in relation to Max Scheler. This philosophical anthropology is also evident in The Tower and the Abyss, in which he formulates a substantive thesis about the historical process in speculative philosophy of history. Various forces, both internal to and external to history, have in our time converged upon the disintegration of the individual. Kahler says, quote, "What we are concerned with is precisely the breakdown of the human form, dissolution of coherence and structure, not inhumanity which has existed all through history and constitutes part of the human form, but ahumanity, a phenomenon of rather recent date. Up to now in the Western world, the human form has been represented by the individual. Hence, the breakdown of the human form becomes apparent in the disintegration of the individual." Unquote. This is, to a large extent, part of the now familiar protest against the dehumanizing effects of modernity. Kahler specifically cites dehumanization, specialization, standardization, anonymization, and interestingly, something you don't find in a lot of books, over-civilization. He says, quote, "We seem to be headed for, indeed, we are actually engaged in a form of life in which the group and not the person is the decisive factor. We live in a world in which the collective and no longer the individual is the standard unit." Unquote. However, Kahler makes a distinction between collective and community, which he calls essentially different kinds of groups, which he helpfully summarizes such that, quote, "Collectives are established by common ends. Communities derive from common origins," unquote. This distinction between community and collective appears on the first page and is developed throughout the book, and towards the end of the distinction frames the choice with which Kahler sees humanity being faced. Quote, we are confronted with the crucial question, will the future belong to a collective or to a community? That is to say, to a grouping controlled by a merely technical necessity, by its autonomous, in fact, automatic course, or to a grouping controlled by man and for the sake of man? And what can we do to influence this development, to rescue the human quality in man? Unquote. But Kahler doesn't just stop with analysis. He proposes some possible remedies. In the final chapter of the book, he even describes what he calls a possible utopia, which includes establishing an institution for the integration of studies, which would involve the study of fundamentals, which Kahler names as, quote, time, space, causality, matter, fact, reality, existence, perception, instinct, person, and so forth, unquote, with an eye toward, quote, study of the convergences and correspondences in the findings of different disciplines and evaluation of the findings of any one discipline with regard to their implications for other disciplines, unquote. It's good to remind ourselves that calls to counter increasing scholarly specialization and the consequent fracturing of knowledge aren't new. But Kahler's utopia isn't especially novel or imaginative. Some of his prescriptions include, quote, cultivation of the vast stretches of untilled but arable, or even still presumed unarable land all over our globe to take care of the food shortage, perseverance in birth control and the teaching of contraception, and reminding civilized people who keep thoughtlessly multiplying of their responsibility for the future of the human generations, including their own, an international anti-poverty program, and an international division of labor to prevent the unrestrained industrialization of our entire globe and the consequent neglect of land cultivation as a result of the new country's aspirations for future independence. Last but not least, a world organization capable of regulating and administering such measures, unquote. We can understand the Tower and the Abbess as belonging to the crisis literature in the philosophy of history that was pervasive in the 20th century. And I've discussed this in several episodes, especially in relation to Sorokin, Barbara Tuchman, and Husserl. A lot of this crisis literature hasn't aged particularly well, and it hasn't aged well because it becomes increasingly evident with time that it was a response to a particular moment in history. And the 20th century does unambiguously represent a crisis in history. It was brutal and violent, but despite the enormous death toll from the world wars of the 20th century and the Spanish flu, not to mention the genocides and the famines, population spiked upwards so suddenly and dramatically that the loss of life from war and disease barely register. I think a lot of the violence and perversity of the 20th century can be put to this sudden spike in population because human societies couldn't assimilate this unprecedented development without showing cracks in existing institutions. I've been slowly coming around to the view that the 20th century was so much of an aberration that we might understand history better if we just studied events up through the 19th century and left off there. But my claims about the 20th century are themselves substantive theses that could inform a speculative philosophy of the history of the 20th century. And I am, of course, a child and a product of the 20th century, and therefore an interested party. It's entirely possible that my claims won't age any better than the claims of an unprecedented crisis in our time. But as a Copernican historian, I'm always going to be skeptical of claims of historical centrality, though I'm not going to say more about that today. And I'm not saying that Kahler's thesis about the disintegration of the individual is wrong. I don't know Kahler's thought well enough to definitively pronounce upon it, and I don't disagree about the dehumanizing forces of modernity, though I wouldn't express it in the particular way that Kahler expressed it. It's in his book, The Meaning of History, that we find the most explicit and systematic engagement with philosophy of history. One of the claims that runs through the meaning of history, and of which I am skeptical, is Kahler's assertion that historical understanding has been largely abandoned in his time. Quote, the great books movement is not the only one to exhibit a basic aversion to the historical and evolutional approach. Positivism, existentialism, the American school of purely descriptive anthropology, the new criticism, and especially in Europe, a trend of thought deriving from Nietzsche, all of them reject the historical point of view. In fact, as will be seen later, a whole epochal mood has found its expression in this anti-historical tendency. Unquote. I have to say I was surprised by his inclusion of the great books movement here, but that's neither here nor there. And the argument can be made for an epochal anti-historical mood, and Kahler tries to make this argument, but there are many who have argued to the contrary that historical understanding has never been more prominent, and that we live in a time of the unquestioned ascendancy of historicism. He opens the meaning of history saying that he intended the book as a defensive history because apparently history in a time of the abandonment of historical understanding was in need of a defense. On this point, I don't think that Kahler has made the case. More importantly, he doesn't engage with or even acknowledge the many claims that history today has a primacy it never had in the past. But I can disagree with Kahler on this and still see the value of his thought. In any case, I find myself at odds with both of the substantive theses about the historical process that I find in Kahler, or at least in regard to the specifics of their formulation. At the same time, I'm sympathetic to his theoretical formulations about the nature of history. He makes his speculative approach to philosophy of history explicit right from the beginning. I sometimes refer to past actuality to emphasize that I'm talking about the historical process and not about its discovery or documentation. Kahler uses the happening itself for a similar purpose and says that history is a particular kind of happening. He compares sheer eternity, that is to say, permanence devoid of all change, to sheer happening, that is to say, a kaleidoscopic melange of events, as being both of them unimaginable and neither of them being history. Quote, to become history, events must, first of all, be related to each other, form a chain, a continuous flow. Continuity, coherence is the elementary prerequisite of history, and not only of history, but even of the simplest story. Unquote. He builds on the ideas of continuity and coherence in history, connecting them to historical meaning. Quote, to form a story, the connection of happenings must have some substratum or focus, something to which it is related, somebody to whom it happens. This something or somebody to which or to whom a connection of events relates is what gives the plain connection of events an actual specific coherence, which turns it into a story. But such specific coherence is not given of itself. It is given by a perceiving and comprehending mind. It is created as a concept, that is, as a meaning. Thus, to make even a simple story, three factors are indispensable: connection of events, relatedness of this connection to something or somebody, which gives the events their specific coherence, and finally, a comprehending mind which perceives this coherence and creates the concept which means a meaning, unquote. So Kahler maintained that meaning is central to history, but what does he mean by meaning? The first part of the meaning of history is titled The Meaning of Meaning, and here he takes on the question of meaning explicitly. He makes an interesting distinction that I think I haven't found anywhere else, but I think is important, and that is a distinction between meaning as purpose and meaning as form. Quote, two modes of meaning may be distinguished: meaning as purpose or goal, and meaning as form. Any action, design, or quest or search carries meaning as purpose. Any work of art is meaning as form, unquote. He also calls meaning as form immanent transcendence. And I guess by the same token, you could call meaning as purpose transcendent transcendence, but he doesn't say that, I think, for obvious reasons. Later, when he's discussing Polybius and the achievements of Greek historiography, he says, quote, the Greeks have expressed to perfection the meaning of history as form, unquote, and, quote, the Greek view of human happenings established meaning as a form, constituted, as we have seen, a dynamization of eternity through the assumption of a cyclic recurrence of events, unquote. The distinction between meaning and purpose and meaning as form is valuable because it attempts to articulate our institutions about what is meaningful by distinguishing the ways in which we might find an event or a process in history to be meaningful. In ordinary language, we don't carefully distinguish between the senses of meaning, and so fuzzy are our intuitions that there are different ways to go about doing this. Whereas Kahler made purpose one kind of meaning, Hannah Arendt, by contrast, made a distinction between meaning and purpose that makes the two mutually exclusive. She wrote, quote, the moment such distinctions are forgotten and meanings are degraded into ends, it follows that ends themselves are no longer safe because the distinction between ends and means is no longer understood, so that finally all ends turn and are degraded into means, unquote. For Arendt, construing a purpose as a meaning is a degraded form of historical understanding, so the relationship between meaning and purpose is hierarchical, while in Kahler, purpose is one kind of meaning. I prefer Kahler's formulation, but this is an area of thought that definitely cries out for clarification. But since so few philosophers of history are willing to take on the problem of meaning in history, it doesn't get the clarification it needs. So at least Kahler is willing to explicitly talk about the meaning of history, which is something a lot of philosophers avoid. In taking up the theme of the meaning of history, Kahler is taking up one of the great questions of philosophy, and that is conceptually risky. Compare this, for example, to Adorno, about whom I recently spoke. The great anxiety of Adorno's philosophy of history is that some meaning might be attributed to history that history doesn't intrinsically possess. And Adorno thinks that would be a terrible thing to happen. Kahler turns the tables on this and asserts that history is history only because it has meaning. Quote, to deny that history has meaning is to deny that history exists, unquote. There's an ambiguity about meaning that's being exploited here between the examples used by Adorno and Kahler. Adorno is mostly concerned about the meaning of the whole of history, that is to say, meanings of history like progress or declension or salvation or what have you. This is a leap made to the most comprehensive meanings that might be imposed on history, and they often come across to us as being imposed, and they're rejected as philosophers' fantasies by most historians precisely because these comprehensive meanings skip over most of the detail of history. We could call this a top-down conception of meaning in history or a non-constructive approach to historical meaning. Recall that one of the most familiar ideas in philosophy of history is that history is distinguished from natural science by being idiographic or concerned with particulars, whereas natural science is supposedly concerned with universal laws, laws of nature, like, for example, force equaling mass times acceleration. If we pass over all the particular details of history, we may as well not be doing history at all. But Kahler comes at meaning from the opposite direction. Instead of starting with the most comprehensive meanings that might be attributed to the whole of history, he starts with particular meanings of particular events. The kind of meanings that constitute history, according to Kahler, can be the modest meaning that any individual finds in the course of the ordinary business of life. Through the process of history and the process of recounting history to ourselves, our historical consciousness grows, and the meanings that we find in history grow proportionally. We could call this the bottom-up conception of meaning in history, or a constructivist approach to historical meaning. This is worked out in greater detail in the central section of the meaning of history, titled The History of History, which is a close and careful reading of the entire tradition of Western historiography, starting with Heraclitus, Aristotle, and Herodotus, and taking the development of history and historical consciousness up through the 19th century. This is the longest section of the book, while the essays that precede and follow it are more compact statements of the principles of his philosophy of history. For Kahler, the meaning of history is built up from below, incrementally but insistently. Meaning grows as history grows, and history grows as meaning grows. It would only be at the end of history that we could converge on the meaning of the totality of history. And in this way, we could understand both comprehensive meaning and the totality of history as ends on which we converge, but which we don't reach in any finite period of time, like the meeting of parallel lines at the horizon. This strikes me as a valuable contribution and a better way to look at meaning in history. And I think we need a lot more of this in philosophy of history, especially in comparison to the kind of despair that we find, for example, in Adorno. And of course, Adorno is much better known than Kahler. I guess despair sells more books. I also think we can profitably compare Kahler's approach to philosophy of history with that of Karl Löwit. Kahler is, in a sense, the counterpart to Löwit, Löwit's other, we could say, with a capital O, as in continental philosophy. Kahler has one long footnote on Löwit, and that's it. He doesn't belabor his critique of Löwit, though it's bound up with his distinction between meaning as purpose and meaning as form. Löwit, he says, assumes meaning as purpose and traps himself by this assumption. Maybe in a future episode, I'll return to Kahler's footnote on Löwit because it's quite pregnant with meaning and there's a lot that could be said about it. Löwit read the history of philosophy of history as a concealed pursuit of religious ends. Kahler doesn't deny that history has been informed by traditional eschatology. Rather, he embraces this as a stage in the development of the conception of history and the expansion of historical consciousness. That is to say, he takes it up and runs with it. The eschatological dimension of philosophy of history is part of the growth of meaning and the growth of historical consciousness, no less than the earlier Greek contribution or the later modern contribution. We know that Löwit also received pushback from Hans Blumenberg, though the Löwit-Blumenberg debate was about secularization and modernity and not so much about the possibility of a philosophy of history. But the problems obviously overlap, so the Löwit-Blumenberg debate is relevant to Kahler's criticism of Löwit. As we saw with Kahler's The Tower and the Abyss, he was as concerned as anyone in the 20th century with the problem of modernity. But he doesn't take this as a reason to deny the possibility of a philosophy of history or to interpret the whole history of philosophy of history as a failed spiritual quest, as seems to be the case in Löwit. Löwit, like Adorno, was worried about reading meanings into history that weren't there. And again, Kahler's approach to building up meanings through the history of human thought and the expansion of human consciousness that expands history comes at this from such different presuppositions that the two approaches pass each other by rather than meeting in the middle. Again, this demands a deeper and more detailed inquiry to bring out everything that's at play in the problem. So happy birthday, Erich Kahler, and thanks for listening.